I still remember the exact moment my father looked me in the eye and told me I was never really his daughter. It happened 3 weeks before his 70th birthday celebration, an event my family had been planning for months. The words hit harder than any slap ever could because they came after 42 years of believing I belonged in that family. My name is Claire Thompson, and until that night, I thought I knew exactly where I stood. I was sitting in my father's study, surrounded by shelves filled with awards, photographs, and trophies that documented his success as a real estate developer. The room smelled of expensive leather and old money. My younger brother, Jason, sat beside him, wearing the smug expression he always wore whenever he thought he had won something. My stepmother, Linda, stood near the window with her arms folded. I had been invited there because they claimed they needed to discuss family business. Instead, I walked into an ambush. My father cleared his throat and slid a folder across the desk. "I've finalized my estate plan," he said. "Everything is settled." I opened the folder expecting routine paperwork. What I found instead left me speechless. Nearly $4 million in assets, including properties, investments, and company shares, were designated entirely to Jason. My name appeared only once in the entire document. Beside it was a note stating I would receive a one-time payment of $10,000. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. "Dad, this can't be right," I said. Jason smirked. Linda looked away. Then my father leaned back in his chair and delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Claire, you're not really my daughter anymore." The room went silent. I stared at him, waiting for an explanation that would somehow make those words less cruel. None came. Instead, he continued. "A real daughter stays loyal to the family business. A real daughter doesn't leave to build her own life. A real daughter doesn't question her father's decisions." I could barely process what I was hearing. 20 years earlier, I had left the company to become an architect. I wanted to create buildings, not manage rental properties. My father had never forgiven me for that decision. Apparently, he had spent decades holding on to that resentment. "So because I chose a different career, I'm not your daughter?" I asked. "You made your choice years ago," he replied coldly. Jason finally spoke. "Dad's simply recognizing who actually carried the family legacy." I looked at my brother and saw exactly what was happening. This wasn't about loyalty. It wasn't about business. It was about greed. Jason had spent years positioning himself as the favored child while quietly pushing me further away from the family. Now he was being rewarded with a fortune. I stood up and prepared to leave, but then I noticed something strange on the desk. Beneath the estate papers sat another folder partially hidden under a notebook. Across the tab, I could read 3 words: Harbor Heights Acquisition. The name immediately caught my attention because Harbor Heights was a massive waterfront development project my architectural firm had recently evaluated. The project involved land worth tens of millions of dollars. Before leaving, I casually pointed toward the folder. "Working on something new?" I asked. My father's expression changed instantly. He quickly closed the folder and slid it into a drawer. "That's none of your concern." The reaction was so sudden that it raised every alarm in my mind. My father rarely hid business matters from me. In fact, he usually bragged about them. But this time he looked nervous. Very nervous. I walked out of the house furious, humiliated, and heartbroken. Yet by the time I reached my car, another emotion had begun replacing the pain. Curiosity. Something about Harbor Heights bothered me. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that folder. Then an old colleague from city planning called me with unexpected news. During a casual conversation, he mentioned that several investors were trying to secure approval for a controversial waterfront redevelopment deal. When he named the investors involved, my father's company was at the top of the list. What shocked me was the estimated value. If approved, the deal would instantly increase my father's wealth by nearly $4 million. Suddenly, everything made sense. The inheritance changes, the secret meetings, the nervous reaction when I noticed the folder. But I still didn't understand why they were rushing to cut me out. That answer arrived 1 week later when I received an anonymous email containing documents that would expose the most shocking betrayal of my life. As I opened the files and started reading, I realized my father and brother weren't simply planning to exclude me from their fortune. They were hiding something that could destroy everything they had built. And for the first time, I understood why they were so desperate to convince everyone that I was never really part of the family. The problem for them was that they had no idea what I was about to discover next. The anonymous email arrived at 11:43 on a Tuesday night while I was finishing drawings for a commercial project. Normally, I ignored messages from unknown senders, but the subject line immediately caught my attention. Before they steal everything. Attached were dozens of documents, spreadsheets, meeting notes, and scanned contracts. At first the files seemed unrelated, but after several hours of reading, a disturbing pattern emerged. Harbor Heights was far more than a redevelopment project. It was the centerpiece of a complicated financial scheme involving my father's company, several shell corporations, and a group of investors who believed they were purchasing land that would soon receive city approval. The problem was that some of the information being provided to those investors appeared intentionally misleading. Certain environmental reports had been omitted. Several cost projections were dramatically understated. Most alarming of all, a private assessment predicted that a major portion of the waterfront site could face severe construction restrictions once a pending government review was completed. If those restrictions became public, the land value could collapse. Yet investors were still being encouraged to pour millions into the project. I spent the next several days verifying every document. As an architect with years of development experience, I knew how to identify authentic reports and permits. The more I checked, the more genuine the files appeared. Whoever sent them knew exactly where to look. One document stood out above all others. It was a memorandum prepared for my father and Jason 6 months earlier. The final paragraph made my stomach turn. It stated that if approval delays occurred, family assets should be transferred into protected entities before investors became aware of the risks. In other words, they were preparing an escape route. I wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation, but every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Then I discovered something even worse. Buried in the financial records was a list of future ownership allocations for Harbor Heights after completion. Jason's name appeared repeatedly. Linda's name appeared repeatedly. My father's name appeared repeatedly. Then I found mine. Next to my name was a single notation. No participation. That phrase felt familiar. It was the same language used in the revised estate documents. They hadn't merely removed me from an inheritance. They had systematically excluded me from every major financial opportunity connected to the family. The following afternoon I met with my longtime friend Rebecca, a corporate attorney who specialized in fraud investigations. We spent nearly 4 hours reviewing the files. When we finished, she closed the last folder and looked at me carefully. If these documents are authentic, your family is taking enormous risks. Illegal risks? I asked. She paused. Potentially. At minimum, they're exposing investors to information they may not fully understand. I leaned back in my chair. Why would they do this? Rebecca didn't hesitate. Because $4 million makes people believe they're smarter than everyone else. That answer stayed with me. Over the next week, I quietly gathered more information. I contacted former employees, reviewed public records, and examined city planning documents. Every new detail strengthened the same conclusion. My father and Jason believed Harbor Heights would make them untouchable. They were already spending money they hadn't earned. Jason had reportedly placed deposits on luxury properties. Linda was discussing international travel and retirement plans. My father was planning a lavish 70th birthday gala where he intended to announce what he called the next great chapter of the Thompson legacy. The guest list included investors, politicians, business partners, reporters, and nearly every influential person in the city. Then I learned something that changed everything. One evening, an accountant who had previously worked for my father's company agreed to meet me confidentially. We sat in a quiet cafe on the opposite side of town. He arrived carrying a worn briefcase and looked nervous from the moment he sat down. After confirming that our conversation would remain private, He opened the case and slid a document across the table. It was a draft presentation prepared for the birthday gala. My father intended to publicly unveil Harbor Heights during the event. Investors would be invited to commit additional funding on the spot. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the final slide. At the bottom appeared a statement describing Jason as the sole heir and future leader of the Thompson empire because he was the only child who remained loyal to the family vision. I stared at those words for several seconds. They weren't merely excluding me financially. They were rewriting history in front of hundreds of people. The accountant shook his head. A lot of employees aren't happy about what's happening. Why send this to me? I asked. He answered quietly. Because your father used to be respected. Now people are afraid of him. Someone needs to stop this before innocent people lose money. As I drove home that night, I realized I was facing a choice. I could walk away and let my family continue their plan. Or I could expose everything. The second option carried serious consequences. If I acted, there would be no reconciliation, no second chances, no repairing the relationship. But the more I thought about my father's words, "You're not really my daughter anymore," the easier the decision became. If they wanted to erase me from the family, they were about to discover that I still knew every weakness hidden behind the Thompson name. The gala was only 12 days away. Hundreds of guests would attend. Millions of dollars were at stake. And for the first time, I began designing a plan of my own. By the time my father's birthday arrived, his $4 million dream would be hanging by a thread. What I didn't know yet was that another secret, buried for more than 40 years, was about to surface, and it would change the entire story. The secret surfaced 3 days after my meeting with the former accountant. I was sitting in my office reviewing property records when my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. Normally, I ignored unknown calls, but something told me to answer. A quiet, elderly woman's voice greeted me. "Claire Thompson?" she asked. "Yes." There was a brief silence. "My name is Margaret Ellis. I knew your mother." The moment she said those words, my attention sharpened. My mother had died when I was 17, and very few people ever spoke about her anymore. Margaret asked if we could meet in person because what she needed to discuss was too important for a phone call. The next afternoon, I met her at a small cafe near the waterfront. She appeared to be in her late 70s and carried a large envelope that looked as though it had been stored away for years. After a few minutes of conversation, she slid the envelope across the table. "Your mother asked me to keep these if anything ever happened to her," she said. My heart began to race. Inside were old letters, photographs, legal documents, and a handwritten journal. Most of it seemed deeply personal. Then I found a sealed letter with my name written across the front in my mother's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter had been written nearly 25 years earlier. I read every word twice, then a third time. By the time I finished, I felt as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. According to my mother's own account, my father had once attempted to remove her from ownership of several family assets during a financial dispute early in their marriage. She discovered the plan before it was completed and confronted him. The conflict nearly ended their marriage. Eventually, a settlement was reached, and several assets were placed into legal structures designed to protect her interests and mine. But one sentence stood out above everything else. "If your father ever tries to deny your place in this family, remember that your grandfather ensured you would always have rights that cannot be taken away." I immediately turned to the remaining documents. Hidden among them was a trust agreement signed decades ago by my grandfather. My grandfather had been the true founder of the family's wealth. Before his death, he established a trust containing ownership interests in several properties. What shocked me was that I was specifically named as a beneficiary. Not Jason, not Linda, me. I called Rebecca immediately. Within hours, we were reviewing every page together. Her expression became more serious with each document. Finally, she looked up. "Claire, your father may not actually control everything he thinks he controls." "What do you mean?" I asked. She pointed to several sections of the trust. "These assets were structured very carefully. If the trust is still valid, certain transfers could require beneficiary disclosures. If disclosures weren't properly made, there could be major legal problems. Suddenly, dozens of pieces began fitting together. My father's urgency, the inheritance changes, the effort to publicly discredit me. If Harbor Heights depended on assets connected to the trust, my existence as a beneficiary could complicate everything. Perhaps that was why they wanted me erased from the narrative. Not because I wasn't family, but because I was. Over the next week, Rebecca and her team worked nonstop. They traced ownership records, reviewed filings, and examined transactions linked to Harbor Heights. The results were astonishing. Several properties involved in the redevelopment deal appeared connected to trust assets originating from my grandfather's estate. The situation was legally complex, but one fact became increasingly clear. My father had never informed me about certain developments affecting assets in which I potentially held interests. The implications were enormous. Then another breakthrough arrived. One of Rebecca's investigators uncovered internal communications between Jason and several project consultants. In those messages, Jason repeatedly discussed the need to keep me uninformed until after the gala announcement. One email included a sentence that made my blood boil. Once the investors commit, Claire won't matter anymore. There it was, the entire strategy in a single sentence. They weren't simply excluding me. They were trying to lock everything into place before I could ask questions. That night, I sat alone in my apartment surrounded by documents. For years, I had blamed myself for the distance between my father and me. I thought maybe I should have stayed in the family business. Maybe I should have tried harder. Maybe I should have compromised more. But now I saw the truth. This wasn't about anything I had done. It was about control. My father expected absolute obedience. The moment I chose my own path, he began viewing me as a threat rather than a daughter. The next morning, I received an invitation to the gala. It arrived in a gold envelope embossed with the Thompson family crest. Inside was a formal announcement celebrating my father's 70th birthday and the future of the Thompson legacy. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Linda. "We hope you'll attend and support your family." I laughed out loud when I read it. After everything they had done, they still expected me to sit quietly in the audience while they erased me in front of the entire city. I placed the invitation on my desk and stared at it for several minutes. Then I called Rebecca. "How much evidence do we have?" I asked. "Enough to ask very uncomfortable questions," she replied. "Enough to stop them?" Another pause. "Possibly." I looked at the invitation again. The gala was now only 4 days away. Hundreds of influential guests would be present. Investors would be watching. Reporters would be taking notes. My father intended to celebrate the completion of his plan. Instead, he was about to witness the beginning of its collapse. But even then, I had no idea that someone much closer to him was preparing a betrayal of their own. And when that person finally stepped forward, the damage to my father's $4 million dream would become impossible to contain. For days before the gala, I received a message that initially looked insignificant. It came from a former executive assistant who had worked for my father for nearly 15 years before abruptly leaving the company the previous year. Her name was Denise Harper, and aside from occasional holiday greetings, we had barely spoken since her departure. The message contained only 6 words: "I know what's really happening." Beneath it was a phone number and a request to meet privately. Within 2 hours, we were sitting in a quiet corner of a hotel lounge far from downtown. Denise looked nervous, constantly scanning the room before speaking. Finally, she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Your father doesn't know I'm talking to you." "Then why are you?" I asked. Denise took a long breath. "Because what they're doing now is worse than anything I saw while working there." She opened a tablet and began showing me files she had quietly retained after leaving the company. Some were calendars. Others were meeting summaries and internal communications. As we reviewed them, a timeline emerged. For nearly 2 years, Jason had been preparing to take complete control of the family empire. He wasn't merely inheriting assets. He was systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge him. Former executives had been pushed out. Longtime advisors had been ignored. Even trusted consultants were being replaced with people loyal only to Jason. Then Denise showed me something that stopped me cold. It was a recording. The date stamp showed it had been made 6 months earlier during a private strategy meeting. Jason's voice was unmistakable. Once Harbor Heights closes, Claire becomes irrelevant. Dad still worries about appearances, but eventually she'll disappear from the picture completely. Another voice asked, "What about the trust issues?" Jason laughed. "By then, nobody will care." The room fell silent as the recording ended. Denise looked at me carefully. "There are more." Over the next hour, I listened to conversation after conversation. Some discussed investors. Some discussed publicity. Several discussed me directly. In every recording, Jason treated me as an obstacle that needed to be removed. Not physically harmed. Not threatened. Simply erased. Every accomplishment I had achieved outside the family business was mocked. Every contribution I had ever made was dismissed. The most shocking recording came last. In it, my father sounded hesitant about excluding me entirely from the inheritance. For a brief moment, I almost felt hope. Then Jason convinced him otherwise. If Claire stays involved, she'll slow everything down. She's always asking questions. She's always challenging decisions. We need unity. My father remained quiet for several seconds before finally answering. "Do whatever is necessary." Hearing those words hurt more than I expected. Deep down, part of me had still hoped my father was being manipulated, that he didn't fully understand what was happening. The recordings destroyed that illusion. He knew. He simply chose Jason anyway. Denise then revealed the reason she had contacted me. 3 days earlier, she learned that Harbor Heights investors were expected to commit additional funding during the gala based on presentations that still omitted several critical risk assessments. She believed people were about to make financial decisions without seeing the full picture. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," she said. Before leaving, she handed me a flash drive containing copies of everything. As I drove home that evening, I realized the situation had become much larger than a family dispute. Investors could lose millions. Business partners could be misled. Public officials could face scrutiny. The gala was no longer just a birthday celebration. It was the final stage of a carefully orchestrated performance. The next day, Rebecca's legal team completed another review of the trust documents. The findings were even more significant than we expected. Certain disclosures connected to trust-linked assets appeared incomplete. Rebecca couldn't guarantee how a court would ultimately rule, but she was confident of one thing. If the information became public during the gala, investors would immediately start asking questions. Lots of questions. That evening, I received another surprise. An old family friend named Charles Monroe requested a meeting. Charles had known my grandfather for decades and attended nearly every major family event throughout my childhood. When we met, he wasted no time. "Your grandfather anticipated this possibility," he said. "What possibility?" I asked. Charles smiled sadly. "Your father allowing money to become more important than family." He then revealed that my grandfather had once expressed concerns about concentrating too much power in a single heir. According to Charles, the trust was specifically designed to prevent exactly what Jason was attempting to do now. Before leaving, Charles gave me copies of correspondence between himself and my grandfather discussing future protections for beneficiaries. The documents strengthened our position even further. For the first time, I could see a path forward. Not a path toward revenge for its own sake, but a path toward exposing the truth. The following morning, the city newspaper published an article announcing the gala. The event was being described as one of the largest private celebrations of the year. Business leaders, investors, and media figures were expected to attend. My father would unveil his vision for the future. Jason would be formally introduced as successor. Harbor Heights would be presented as a transformative opportunity. Reading the article, I almost admired the scale of their confidence. They truly believed they had already won. What they didn't know was that several key attendees were already receiving information from independent sources. Rebecca had quietly contacted certain parties who deserved to review the facts before making decisions. Denise had spoken to additional former employees. Questions were beginning to circulate. Small questions at first. The kind that spreads quietly through boardrooms and private conversations. Then, 2 nights before the gala, everything changed again. At exactly 9:17 p.m., my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in years. It was my cousin Emily. We were close growing up, but family politics had gradually pushed us apart. Her voice sounded tense. "Claire, I need to tell you something before Saturday." "What is it?" I asked. There was a long pause. Then she said the words that made my heart race. "Jason isn't just hiding information from investors. He's hiding information from your father too." Suddenly the entire game changed. Because if Emily was telling the truth, the man who thought he controlled a $4 million empire was about to discover that his own son had been running a separate plan behind his back. And that secret had the potential to destroy the Thompson family from the inside out. When Emily told me Jason was hiding something from our father, I assumed she meant another financial maneuver or undisclosed business arrangement. I was wrong. The truth was far bigger. We met the next morning at a small restaurant outside the city. Emily arrived carrying a thick envelope and looked as though she hadn't slept all night. After ordering coffee, she immediately pushed the envelope across the table. "You need to see this before the gala." Inside were copies of contracts, emails, and banking records. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then Emily pointed to a company name that appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. The company was registered in another state and seemed unrelated to the Thompson organization. Yet Jason's signature appeared on several forms. More importantly, the company was positioned to receive substantial consulting fees from Harbor Heights after investor funds were secured. "What is this?" I asked. Emily shook her head. "A private arrangement Jason never disclosed to your father." The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Through a series of side agreements, Jason had structured compensation packages that could quietly redirect hundreds of thousands of dollars into entities he personally controlled. If Harbor Heights succeeded, he wouldn't merely inherit the family empire. He would profit independently while everyone else believed he was acting solely in the company's interest. "Does Dad know?" I asked. "Not from what I've seen," Emily replied. The realization hit me immediately. Jason hadn't just manipulated me. He hadn't just manipulated investors. He had manipulated our father as well. For years, my father believed Jason was the loyal son carrying forward the family legacy. Meanwhile, Jason was quietly building his own financial escape routes behind the scenes. Suddenly, many things made sense. Jason's impatience, his constant pressure to finalize deals quickly, his determination to remove anyone who asked difficult questions. The Harbor Heights project wasn't simply a family opportunity. It was his opportunity. My father was useful only as long as he remained unaware. Emily then revealed how she discovered the information. While assisting with event preparations for the gala, she accidentally gained access to several internal files stored on a shared server. The more she reviewed them, the more concerned she became. Eventually, she copied the documents and began investigating independently. What she found alarmed her enough to contact me. "I know we're not as close as we used to be," she said quietly, "but this has gone too far." For the next several hours, Rebecca's legal team analyzed the new evidence. Their conclusions were explosive. While some arrangements might ultimately prove legal, the failure to fully disclose them created serious questions about conflicts of interest and fiduciary responsibilities. More importantly, investors would likely view the information very negatively. By late afternoon, I realized something remarkable. The foundation of Jason's entire strategy depended on one assumption: that nobody would connect all the pieces before the gala. But now multiple people knew the truth. Former employees knew. Attorneys knew. Certain advisors knew. Emily knew. And I knew. The illusion of control was beginning to crack. That evening, another unexpected development occurred. My father called me for the first time in months. His voice sounded unusually formal. "Claire, I wanted to personally confirm you'll be attending Saturday." I almost laughed at the timing. "Why?" I asked. "Because despite our disagreements, you're still family." The irony was astonishing. Just weeks earlier he had told me I wasn't really his daughter. Now, with important guests watching, he suddenly wanted to project unity. Interesting, I replied. I thought I wasn't family anymore. There was a long silence. Finally he said, let's not revisit old arguments. Old arguments. That was how he described one of the most painful conversations of my life. I could hear the discomfort in his voice. He knew things were strained. He simply assumed he still controlled the narrative. Before ending the call, he added something unexpected. I hope you'll keep an open mind during the presentation. The statement seemed innocent at first, but after everything I had learned, it sounded more like a warning. After hanging up, I spent the evening reviewing every document collected over the previous weeks. The evidence now filled multiple boxes: trust records, internal communications, investor materials, audio recordings, financial agreements, historical correspondence. Separately, each piece raised questions. Together, they told a devastating story. A story of greed, secrecy, manipulation, and betrayal. The next day, the day before the gala, Rebecca gathered our entire team for a final strategy meeting. We reviewed every possible scenario. If investors asked questions, we had documentation. If reporters requested clarification, we had documentation. If legal disputes emerged, we had documentation. Then Rebecca looked directly at me. There is one thing you need to decide. What's that? I asked. Do you want to expose everything publicly tomorrow? The room became silent. It was the question I had been avoiding. Because once the truth became public, there would be no going back. My father's reputation could suffer permanent damage. Jason's future could change dramatically. The family might never recover. I thought about the years of manipulation, the inheritance documents, the recordings, the lies, the effort to erase me. Then I remembered the sentence that started everything. You're not really my daughter anymore. My decision became easy. Yes, I said. The truth comes out tomorrow. Nobody argued. Nobody tried to stop me. The evidence would speak for itself. That night I barely slept. Across the city, workers transformed a luxury hotel ballroom into a spectacular venue for my father's celebration. Thousands of flowers arrived. Cameras were installed. Catering teams prepared meals. Investors flew in from different states. Reporters confirmed attendance. Jason believed he was about to secure his future. My father believed he was about to celebrate his legacy. Neither man understood that dozens of hidden truths were moving toward the same collision point. By noon the next day, guests would begin arriving. By evening, the gala would be underway. And before the night ended, someone would stand before hundreds of witnesses and reveal information capable of destroying a $4 million dream in a matter of minutes. The only remaining question was who would lose everything first: Jason, my father, or both. The morning of the gala arrived with an almost surreal sense of calm. After weeks of gathering evidence, uncovering secrets, and preparing for confrontation, there was nothing left to investigate. Everything that could be discovered had already been discovered. Everything that could be documented had been documented. The outcome would now depend on what happened inside a ballroom filled with hundreds of powerful people. I spent the morning reviewing our final materials one last time. Rebecca and her team organized everything into clearly labeled files. We had copies stored digitally and physically. Nothing could conveniently disappear. Around noon, I received several photographs from contacts attending the event preparations. The ballroom looked spectacular. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Giant screens displayed images celebrating my father's life and achievements. A stage had been constructed at the front of the room. Elegant centerpieces decorated dozens of tables. The entire event looked less like a birthday celebration and more like a corporate coronation. In many ways, that was exactly what it was. My father intended to celebrate 70 years of life while publicly transferring influence and prestige to Jason. Harbor Heights would be presented as the next great chapter. Investors would applaud. Reporters would write glowing articles. Everyone would leave believing the Thompson empire was stronger than ever. At least that was the plan. By 6 o'clock, guests began arriving. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance. Business leaders mingled with investors. Politicians greeted donors. Reporters interviewed attendees near the red carpet. Through various contacts, I learned that excitement surrounding Harbor Heights was unusually high. Many guests expected major announcements. Some investors were reportedly prepared to increase their commitments immediately after the presentation. The stakes were enormous. At 7:30, I arrived at the hotel. The moment I entered the ballroom, I noticed something interesting. Despite the smiles and handshakes, there was tension beneath the surface. Small groups whispered quietly. Certain guests seemed distracted. Rumors had clearly begun circulating. Not enough to derail the event, but enough to create uncertainty. Jason stood near the stage greeting investors with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already guaranteed. My father moved through the crowd accepting congratulations. Linda appeared delighted. For a brief moment, I wondered whether any of them sensed what was coming. If they did, they hid it well. Then something unexpected happened. My father approached me personally. Several guests watched as he extended his hand. "I'm glad you came," he said. The performance was flawless. Anyone observing would assume we were a close family. I shook his hand. "Wouldn't miss it." His smile remained fixed, but I noticed concern in his eyes. Perhaps he sensed I knew more than he expected. Perhaps he simply felt uncomfortable after everything that had happened between us. Either way, neither of us mentioned the inheritance. Neither of us mentioned the trust. Neither of us mentioned Harbor Heights. The evening continued. Dinner was served. Speeches were delivered. Guests applauded repeatedly. Then, shortly after 9 o'clock, the main presentation began. The ballroom lights dimmed. A large video played across the screens, showcasing my father's career achievements. The audience responded enthusiastically. When the video ended, my father walked onto the stage to a standing ovation. He spent several minutes thanking friends, partners, and family members. Then he began discussing the future. Harbor Heights appeared on the giant screens behind him. Architectural renderings displayed waterfront buildings, parks, and commercial spaces. The audience seemed impressed. Investors nodded approvingly. Reporters took notes. My father described opportunity, growth, and legacy. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Then Jason joined him on stage. Together they outlined the project's potential. Revenue projections appeared. Development timelines appeared. Expansion opportunities appeared. What did not appear were the risk assessments. What did not appear were the trust complications. What did not appear were Jason's undisclosed financial arrangements. The omissions were as important as the information being presented. Finally, my father reached the moment he had been building toward all evening. He placed a hand on Jason's shoulder and addressed the audience. "Tonight, I am proud to recognize the person who will carry our family's vision into the future." Applause filled the room. Jason smiled confidently. Then my father delivered the line I had already seen in the leaked presentation. "Jason is the only child who remained loyal to the Thompson legacy." The room applauded again. I remained seated. Several people glanced in my direction. They knew exactly who he was referring to. My father continued speaking. "Leadership requires commitment, sacrifice, loyalty." Then he formally announced Jason as his successor. More applause followed. Investors appeared pleased. Reporters typed furiously. Jason looked triumphant. He genuinely believed he had won. Then something happened that nobody on stage expected. A voice from the audience interrupted the celebration. "Before we continue, I have a question." The room fell silent. The speaker was not me. It was one of the investors. He stood slowly and held a folder in his hand. My heart immediately recognized what was happening. The rumors had reached him. The questions had begun. Jason's expression changed slightly. My father's smile faded. The investor continued. "Can someone explain why several risk assessments related to Harbor Heights were not included in tonight's presentation?" The silence that followed felt endless. Hundreds of guests turned toward the stage. Reporters stopped typing. Cameras shifted position. For the first time all evening, uncertainty entered the room. Jason stepped forward and attempted to answer, but before he could finish, another voice spoke from a different table. Then another. Then another. More questions followed. Questions about disclosures. Questions about ownership structures. Questions about environmental reports. Questions about side agreements. The celebration was beginning to unravel. And standing in the middle of the ballroom, holding a folder containing evidence that could destroy everything, I realized the moment had finally arrived. What happened next would determine whether the Thompson empire survived the night or collapsed in front of everyone watching. The ballroom that had been filled with applause only moments earlier now felt like a courtroom. Hundreds of guests sat silently as investors began asking questions that Jason and my father clearly had not expected to hear. The confidence that had carried them through the evening started fading with every passing second. One investor stood and referenced environmental reports that were missing from the presentation. Another asked about ownership disclosures connected to Harbor Heights. A third questioned projected development timelines. Reporters immediately sensed the shift and began recording everything. Cameras turned away from the celebration and focused entirely on the stage. My father attempted to regain control. "I assure everyone that Harbor Heights has been thoroughly evaluated," he said. But the statement no longer carried the authority it had 20 minutes earlier. Too many people had already heard rumors. Too many questions had surfaced. Then one of the investors held up a document. "If that's true," he asked, "why does this report predict significant regulatory obstacles that were never mentioned tonight?" The audience murmured. Jason's jaw tightened. My father looked toward him, expecting an explanation. Instead, Jason hesitated. It was only a few seconds, but it was enough. People noticed. They always notice hesitation when millions of dollars are involved. Another investor stood. "And can someone explain these consulting agreements?" This time Jason visibly stiffened. The document he referenced came directly from the materials Emily had uncovered. Several heads turned toward Jason. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. My father glanced at him with growing confusion. Clearly, he had not expected that particular question. The room grew even quieter. Then one of the reporters asked a direct question. "Were all financial interests related to Harbor Heights fully disclosed to investors?" It was a simple question. Yet neither Jason nor my father answered immediately. That silence was devastating. In business, silence often speaks louder than words. I watched from my table as uncertainty spread through the room. Guests whispered to each other. Investors compared documents. Advisors exchanged concerned looks. The carefully constructed image of complete confidence was beginning to fracture. Then Jason made a mistake. Desperate to regain control, he blamed the concerns on misinformation. "Certain individuals have been spreading false narratives," he said. His eyes briefly moved toward me. It was subtle, but everyone saw it. A few reporters immediately looked in my direction. Jason continued. "People who were never truly involved in this project are attempting to create confusion." There it was. The same strategy he had always used. Attack the messenger instead of addressing the facts. Unfortunately for him, the audience was no longer interested in personal attacks. They wanted answers. Then my father did something unexpected. He turned toward Jason and asked, directly into the microphone, "What consulting agreements are they talking about?" The entire room froze. Jason stared at him. My father stared back. In that moment, everyone realized something important. The two men on stage were no longer operating as a united team. Jason attempted to answer, but his explanation sounded vague and incomplete. The more he spoke, the worse it became. Investors began reviewing documents more aggressively. Several people stood and moved closer together to compare information. Reporters started leaving their seats to make phone calls. The atmosphere had completely transformed. This was no longer a celebration. It was a crisis. Rebecca, seated several tables away, gave me a small nod. She knew the same thing I did. The foundation was cracking. Then another surprise occurred. Denise, the former executive assistant, stood from her table. Nobody had expected her to speak publicly. For years she had remained quietly in the background. But now she walked confidently toward the stage. "I worked for Mr. Thompson for 15 years, she announced. The room immediately became silent again. Denise calmly described concerns she had witnessed during the Harbor Heights planning process. She didn't make accusations. She simply stated facts. Missing disclosures, internal disagreements, questions that were never properly addressed. Her credibility was difficult to attack because she had spent years inside the organization. Then Emily stood as well. One by one, people who had remained silent for months began speaking. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just truthfully. Each statement added another crack to the narrative Jason had built. My father looked increasingly shocked. It became obvious that he was hearing some of this information for the first time. The realization was devastating to watch. The man who had trusted his son above everyone else was discovering that key information had been hidden from him. Then Jason made another mistake. Under pressure, he lost his temper. "None of this would be happening if Claire hadn't interfered," he shouted. The words echoed across the ballroom. Hundreds of eyes immediately turned toward me. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I slowly stood. The room became completely silent. I could feel every gaze following me as I walked toward the stage. My father looked stunned. Jason looked furious. Reporters lifted their cameras. Investors watched closely. I stepped onto the stage and faced the audience. For weeks I had imagined this moment. I thought I might feel angry. I thought I might feel vindicated. Instead, I felt calm. Very calm. I looked directly at my father. Then I looked at Jason. Finally, I addressed the audience. "A few weeks ago," I began. "My father informed me that I was never really his daughter." Audible gasps spread through the room. My father's face immediately drained of color. Reporters started writing again. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. They wanted to hear every word. I continued explaining how I had been excluded from the inheritance, excluded from business decisions, and excluded from information connected to assets that might directly affect my interests. Then I revealed the existence of the trust established by my grandfather decades earlier. The room reacted instantly. Several attorneys present exchanged alarmed looks. Investors began flipping through documents. My father appeared completely stunned. But I wasn't finished. In my hands was a folder containing the final piece of evidence. The piece capable of exposing the full truth about Harbor Heights, Jason's hidden arrangements, and the reason they had worked so hard to erase me from the family story. As I opened the folder and prepared to reveal its contents, I saw something I never expected. For the first time in my life, Jason looked afraid. And deep down, I knew exactly why. Because within the next few minutes, everyone in that ballroom would learn who had really betrayed the Thompson family, and the consequences would be far greater than anyone imagined. I stood at the center of the stage holding the folder while hundreds of people watched in complete silence. Jason's face had gone pale. My father looked as though the ground beneath him was collapsing. Reporters had moved to the front of the room. Investors sat forward in their chairs. Nobody cared about the birthday celebration anymore. Nobody cared about the speeches or the decorations or the expensive dinner. They cared about the truth. Slowly, I opened the folder and removed several documents. "For weeks," I said, "I believed this was a story about a father choosing one child over another. I thought it was about inheritance. I thought it was about Harbor Heights. But after reviewing thousands of pages of records, I discovered something very different." The room remained silent. "This is actually a story about deception." I then displayed copies of the consulting agreements Emily had uncovered. Large screens behind the stage projected the documents so everyone could see them. Gasps spread through the ballroom as specific financial figures appeared. Several investors immediately recognized their significance. The agreements showed that Jason had established private compensation structures connected to Harbor Heights without fully disclosing them to key stakeholders. More importantly, the documents revealed that certain entities under his control stood to benefit significantly from transactions he publicly described as being solely for the family's interests. The audience erupted into whispers. My father grabbed one of the documents from the screen display and stared at it. "Jason," he said quietly, his voice barely carried through the microphone. "What is this?" Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time all evening, he had no prepared response. I continued. "These arrangements were hidden not only from investors but apparently from my father as well." The statement hit the room like a thunderclap. All eyes shifted toward my father. The man who had spent years believing Jason was his most loyal supporter suddenly looked lost. Then I revealed the next set of documents. These were internal emails discussing strategies for keeping certain information away from me until after Harbor Heights funding was secured. Several messages contained Jason's own words. One in particular appeared on the giant screens behind me. "Once the investors commit, Claire won't matter anymore." The audience reacted immediately. Some people shook their heads. Others exchanged shocked looks. Reporters began photographing the screen. The sentence perfectly captured everything that had happened. It wasn't about loyalty. It wasn't about family values. It was about removing obstacles until the money was secured. My father slowly turned toward Jason. The disappointment on his face was impossible to miss. "Did you write that?" he asked. Jason remained silent. That silence was answer enough. Then I reached the final section of evidence. The trust documents established by my grandfather decades earlier. I explained how the trust had been designed specifically to prevent family assets from being concentrated entirely under the control of one person. I explained how beneficiaries had rights that could not simply be erased because someone found them inconvenient. Several attorneys in attendance nodded as they reviewed the material. Investors looked increasingly concerned. The more facts emerged, the more questions arose about Harbor Heights and the assumptions underlying the entire project. Then something happened that nobody expected. My father walked away from the podium and sat down in a chair on the stage. He suddenly looked much older than 70. The powerful businessman who had controlled every room he entered for decades now seemed exhausted. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at the audience. He was staring directly at Jason. Finally, he spoke. "How much of this is true?" The question echoed through the ballroom. Jason glanced around the room as though searching for an escape. There wasn't one. Every path had closed. Every secret had surfaced. Every convenient narrative had collapsed. After several long seconds, he answered. "Most of it." The room exploded with noise. Reporters rushed to make calls. Investors began standing up. Conversations erupted throughout the ballroom. But my attention remained fixed on my father. The expression on his face was heartbreaking. Not because of the money, not because of the project, because he was realizing that the son he trusted completely had manipulated him for years. Then my father looked toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he stood and approached the microphone. The ballroom slowly quieted. Everyone wanted to hear what he would say. "A few weeks ago," he began, "I told Claire she was never really my daughter." His voice cracked slightly. "I was wrong." The room became silent again. He turned toward me. "I spent years confusing obedience with loyalty. I convinced myself that anyone who challenged me was against me. In doing so, I pushed away the one person who was actually trying to tell me the truth. I wasn't expecting an apology. Certainly not in front of hundreds of people. Yet there it was. Public. Unscripted. Genuine." Then he looked toward the audience. "Harbor Heights will be suspended pending a full review." Investors immediately reacted. Some looked relieved. Others looked frustrated. But nobody seemed surprised anymore. The project's future would now depend on facts rather than assumptions. My father then delivered one final statement. "And any decisions regarding family assets will be reconsidered." The room understood exactly what he meant. The inheritance plan, the trust, everything. Jason looked completely defeated. The empire he believed he controlled had vanished in less than an hour. Not because I destroyed it, because his own choices destroyed it. One by one, guests began leaving the ballroom. Reporters hurried toward their offices. Investors scheduled emergency meetings. Advisors gathered documents. The gala was over. The celebration had ended. The $4 million plan lay in ruins. Yet as I watched people depart, I realized the story wasn't quite finished. Because while Jason had lost his position and Harbor Heights had collapsed, one final truth remained unresolved. A truth connected to my grandfather's trust. A truth that would determine who ultimately controlled the future of the Thompson family legacy. And when that final revelation emerged, it would change everything one last time. The morning after the gala felt like the aftermath of an earthquake. News of the confrontation spread across the city before sunrise. Every business publication, local newspaper, and industry website seemed to be discussing the Thompson family. Reporters replayed footage from the event. Investors issued statements. Analysts speculated about the future of Harbor Heights. What had been intended as a triumphant announcement had become one of the most talked about corporate disasters in recent memory. Yet behind the headlines, an even more important battle was beginning. 2 days after the gala, Rebecca called with urgent news. "We need to meet immediately," she said. When I arrived at her office, several members of her legal team were already waiting. Thick stacks of documents covered the conference table. Rebecca pointed toward a collection of records near the center. "We finished tracing the trust assets." "And?" I asked. She took a deep breath. "Your grandfather was more careful than anyone realized." Over the next hour, Rebecca explained what they had discovered. Decades earlier, my grandfather anticipated the possibility that future family conflicts could threaten the integrity of the estate. As a result, he structured portions of the trust with protections that activated under specific circumstances. Those protections had remained dormant for years because nobody bothered examining the trust closely enough. Now that the documents were finally being reviewed in detail, the implications were extraordinary. Certain key decisions regarding major trust-related assets could not legally proceed without beneficiary participation. In simple terms, my father and Jason never possessed as much unilateral authority as they believed. For years they operated under assumptions that were incomplete at best and dangerously inaccurate at worst. I sat quietly absorbing the information. "What does this mean?" I finally asked. Rebecca smiled slightly. "It means your grandfather ensured that no single person could completely control the family's future." The irony was almost unbelievable. The very thing my father had spent years trying to avoid was exactly what my grandfather had intended. Shared responsibility, shared accountability, shared authority. Later that afternoon, my father requested a meeting. For several minutes, I considered declining. The wounds from the past few weeks were still fresh. But eventually I agreed. We met at my grandfather's old property outside the city, a place filled with childhood memories. When I arrived, my father was already there sitting on a bench overlooking the lake. He looked older than he had just a week earlier. Not physically weaker, but burdened. As though years of certainty had suddenly disappeared. For a while neither of us spoke. Finally he broke the silence. "I've reviewed everything." I nodded. "And?" He stared across the water. "I spent years believing I was protecting the family legacy." His voice was quiet. But somewhere along the way, I became more concerned with control than family. Hearing him admit that was significant. My father had never been a man who apologized easily. In fact, I could count the number of sincere apologies he had given during my lifetime on one hand. Yet over the next hour he acknowledged mistakes I never expected him to admit. He admitted favoring Jason. He admitted resenting my decision to leave the family business. He admitted allowing pride to influence decisions that should have been based on fairness. Then he addressed the statement that started everything. "When I said you weren't really my daughter." He paused. "It's the worst thing I've ever said." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I wasn't interested in dramatic reconciliation. Too much had happened for that. But I could see genuine regret in his expression. Not regret because his plan failed. Regret because he finally understood the damage he caused. Then he revealed something surprising. Following the gala, several major investors withdrew support from Harbor Heights pending further review. Independent auditors had also begun examining project documentation. The development wasn't necessarily dead, but it would never proceed under the assumptions that originally supported it. The $4 million dream was effectively over. Jason, meanwhile, had resigned from multiple leadership roles. Several business relationships had collapsed. Friends who once admired him were now distancing themselves. The consequences were unfolding rapidly. "Have you spoken to him?" I asked. My father nodded slowly. "He blames everyone except himself." That answer didn't surprise me. Accountability had never been Jason's strength. As the conversation continued, my father handed me a folder. Inside were revised estate documents. I looked at him questioningly. "These aren't final," he said. "They're a starting point." For the first time in weeks, decisions would be based on transparency rather than secrecy. Whether agreement could ultimately be reached remained uncertain, but at least the process would be honest. Before we left, my father shared one final piece of information. During the trust review, attorneys discovered a sealed letter written by my grandfather shortly before his death. The letter had been stored with trust records and was intended to be opened only if significant disputes arose among beneficiaries. Nobody had read it yet. A formal meeting was scheduled for the following week. Every major beneficiary would attend. My father, me, several relatives, attorneys, trustees. The contents of the letter remained unknown. But given everything else my grandfather had anticipated, nobody expected it to be insignificant. As I drove home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about that letter. Throughout this entire ordeal, my grandfather's influence seemed to appear at every critical moment. He had protected the trust. He had anticipated conflicts. He had created safeguards. Now, even years after his death, he was still shaping the family's future. A week later, everyone gathered in a conference room to hear the letter read aloud. Nobody knew what it contained. Yet as I looked around the table, I sensed that whatever was written inside would determine how the Thompson family story ultimately ended. And when the letter was finally opened, it revealed one last surprise that nobody, not even Rebecca, had seen coming. The revelation would permanently reshape the future of the family and provide the final answer to the question that had haunted me since the night my father claimed I was never really his daughter. My grandfather's letter changed everything. The review panel spent weeks examining records, interviewing witnesses, and studying the events that led to the Harbor Heights collapse. When their work was finished, they concluded that I had acted to protect both the trust and the people affected by the project, while others had prioritized personal gain. Following my grandfather's instructions, the trustees granted me additional authority in trust matters, not as sole leader but as a safeguard against the concentration of power. The irony was impossible to miss. The daughter my father publicly dismissed became the person entrusted with helping protect the family's future. Harbor Heights was permanently abandoned in its original form. Investors recovered much of their money through settlements and restructuring agreements. The company underwent major reforms, and several executives were replaced. Jason resigned from every leadership role he held. At first, he blamed everyone else for what happened, but over time even he was forced to accept that his own decisions had destroyed the future he thought was guaranteed. Within a year, he left the city to begin a different life far away from the family business. As for my father, the consequences were different. Losing money hurt him, but losing trust hurt him far more. For the first time in decades, he had to confront the reality that his obsession with loyalty had nearly cost him both his family and his legacy. Over the following months, he made genuine efforts to repair relationships he had damaged. Some people forgave him, others never did. Trust, once broken, is not restored by a single apology. It is rebuilt through consistent actions over time. One afternoon, nearly a year after the gala, my father invited me back to the lake property where so many important conversations had taken place. We sat on the same bench overlooking the water. After several minutes of silence, he handed me a framed photograph. It showed me as a little girl sitting on my grandfather's shoulders while my father stood beside us smiling. I had not seen the picture in years. "Your grandfather always believed you'd be the strongest one," my father said quietly. I looked at the photograph and then at him. Why didn't you listen to him? He smiled sadly. Because I thought strength meant obedience. He understood that real strength meant having the courage to challenge people when they were wrong. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he said something I never expected to hear. I spent years trying to build a $4 million future and almost destroyed a lifetime of relationships in the process. He looked directly at me. That was the worst investment I ever made. We both laughed softly. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely provides those. The years of hurt could not simply disappear. But there was honesty now where deception once existed. There was accountability where excuses once existed. And there was respect where resentment once existed. Before leaving, my father asked one final question. Can you ever forgive me? I thought carefully before answering. Forgiveness isn't forgetting what happened, I said. It's deciding that what happened won't control the rest of your life. He nodded slowly. For the first time in many years, there was peace between us. As I drove away from the lake that evening, I thought about everything that had happened. My father had publicly declared that I was never really his daughter. He believed money, control, and appearances mattered more than truth. He believed he could erase me from the family's story. Instead, the truth exposed every secret. His $4 million plan collapsed in front of hundreds of witnesses. The son he trusted above everyone else betrayed him. The inheritance he tried to manipulate was rewritten. And the family legacy he wanted to control ended up being protected by the very daughter he tried to cast aside. In the end, I didn't destroy their $4 million dream with revenge. I destroyed it with the truth. And the truth proved something my father finally understood too late to stop. No amount of money can erase who you really are, and no lie can survive forever when the people it was meant to silence decide to speak. The end.